Activists have called for a general strike in Minnesota today, urging people not to go to work, shop, or go to school as part of the ongoing protests against ICE activity in that state.
Now is the time to stand up. Now is the time to organize and to take action. Now is the time to fight back.
Donald Trump is spiraling as he's returned to Washington, D.C., and all of this is happening against the backdrop of something the country hasn't seen in generations, a growing general strike that began in Minnesota and is now spreading across the United States. This isn't a symbolic walkout or a one-day protest. This is a coordinated labor and civil resistance action on a scale we haven't witnessed in roughly 70 years, and the goal is clear. People are standing in solidarity with pro-democracy forces, with workers, with immigrants, and against what many see as an increasingly authoritarian Trump regime that is targeting labor, civil rights, and basic human dignity. In Minnesota, the epicenter of the strike, people in Minneapolis and St. Paul are walking off jobs, calling in sick, and refusing business as usual despite brutal conditions.
Tonight, despite the brutal cold, a massive crowd of anti-ICE protesters flooding downtown Minneapolis. It's part of today's statewide boycott on work, school, and shopping.
Temperatures are hovering around minus 16 degrees Fahrenheit, yet people are still filling the streets. Nurses, service workers, warehouse workers, teachers, and everyday residents are showing up because they believe what's happening right now is bigger than inconvenience or comfort. They're protesting ICE raids, border patrol tactics, and what they describe as a Gestapo-style invasion of communities under the Trump administration. And Minnesota is not alone. Similar actions are beginning to ripple outward across the country.
Murdering our neighbors and terrorizing the most vulnerable working-class members of our society, and we're all here to say, no more, enough is enough.
In Minnesota, thousands braved sub-zero temperatures, while the demonstrations led to clashes with police and arrests in some cities, such as Austin, Texas, and in Los Angeles.
Workers are watching what's happening there and saying, enough. They're asking what leverage regular people actually have when institutions fail them. And many are concluding that collective action is the answer. At the same time, attention has turned to New York City, where more than 15,000 nurses have been on strike for over 9 days. These are frontline healthcare workers who carried hospitals through the pandemic and beyond, now saying they simply cannot continue under the current conditions.
2 days after resuming negotiations, New York City nurses say they're not any closer to reaching a deal.
I say to our bosses, with this offer that they gave us,
they're demanding fair wages, safe staffing levels, and basic respect, while hospital executives and CEOs continue to pull in salaries of $20 to $30 million a year. The contrast couldn't be more stark. New York City's Mayor Zoran Madani has shown solidarity with the nurses. Senator Bernie Sanders has been there as well, standing shoulder to shoulder with them and echoing the same message. Healthcare workers deserve dignity, not exploitation. The nurses' demands are not radical. They're asking for the resources needed to care for patients safely while being paid fairly for highly skilled, emotionally exhausting work.
Don't tell me you can't provide a good nurse-staff ratio when you're paying your CEO at New York Presbyterian $26 million a year.
This is about safe working conditions. This is about a fair contract. This is about dignity.
Back in Minnesota, workers are making similar arguments. The state is home to numerous Fortune 500 companies, enormous corporate wealth, and massive profits. And yet workers say they're treated like disposable cogs, expected to sacrifice endlessly while executives and politicians enrich themselves. Many are openly mocking Trump's priorities, pointing to reports of money flowing into foreign bank accounts, luxury projects, and personal vanity ventures, while healthcare, housing, and worker protections are stripped away. That contrast was on full display this morning when Trump once again took to social media to post AI-generated renderings of massive golden arches he claims he wants to build in Washington, D.C.
That's Lady Liberty. Lady, did you ever hear of Lady Liberty?
We're going to start that pretty soon. It's going to be great. And then the ballroom for the White House is the thing that you people have really, really been very generous with.
Gold everywhere, monumental ego projects, all while millions of Americans are facing rising rents, unaffordable housing, and the loss of health care coverage because Trump refuses to extend Affordable Care Act subsidies. The message many people are hearing is simple. Trump is obsessed with symbols of wealth and power, while ordinary people are barely hanging on. Protesters are saying they don't want golden arches. They want stability. They want to be able to support their families. They want health care. They want to afford rent or buy a home. They want to live without fear of ICE raids, family separations, or militarized immigration enforcement. To them, it's not complicated. It's about dignity. Groups like Migrant Insider have been tracking the spread of the general strike, mapping out actions across multiple states. What's striking is how quickly this has escalated. We've already seen massive No Kings protests, and many activists are saying those demonstrations were just the beginning. Now the conversation has shifted to something more sustained and disruptive. People are asking, what else can we do to make authoritarianism impossible to ignore? How do we force those in power to feel the consequences of their actions? For many, the answer is collective economic pressure. A general strike doesn't rely on courts or politicians. It relies on people refusing to keep the system running as usual when that system is being used against them. That's why this moment feels different. It's not just outrage, it's organized resistance. As all of this unfolds, Trump himself appears increasingly unhinged. This morning, he posted a rant mocking climate science, pointing to an incoming cold wave across 40 states and sneering, "Whatever happened to global warming?" while labeling environmental advocates as insurrectionists. The irony is staggering. Trump openly argues for taking Greenland because melting Arctic ice is opening new shipping routes, an admission that climate change is real, while simultaneously denying its existence. Extreme cold, extreme heat, destabilized weather patterns. These are exactly the kinds of consequences climate scientists have warned about for decades. But logic has never been Trump's strong suit. Instead, he lashes out, insults anyone who disagrees with him, and labels entire groups of Americans as enemies. Protesters become insurrectionists. Workers become criminals. Dissent itself becomes a threat to the state, and that rhetoric is increasingly being backed up by policy and force. This sense of authoritarian drift is exactly why people are in the streets in sub-zero temperatures. They see what's happening, they're connecting the dots, and they're saying that if this is what democracy looks like under Trump, then democracy needs defending in ways that go beyond voting alone. And this is just the beginning of what's unfolding right now. As Trump melts down online, the international fallout from his behavior is only adding fuel to the fire. And it's becoming clearer by the day that this isn't just a domestic crisis anymore. When Trump returned from Davos, he didn't just bring back embarrassment. He brought back diplomatic wreckage, and some of the ugliest consequences are being felt by America's closest allies. One of the most explosive moments came when Trump lashed out at the United Kingdom after leaving Davos, claiming that NATO allies didn't help us at all in past wars, and that they made no meaningful sacrifices alongside the United States. That claim is not just false, it's deeply insulting. British troops fought and died alongside American soldiers in Afghanistan after NATO invoked Article 5 for the first and only time in its history in response to the September 11th attacks. More than 450 UK service members lost their lives. The same is true for Danish, Canadian, French, and other NATO troops who stood shoulder to shoulder with Americans on the front lines. Trump's rhetoric effectively branded those fallen soldiers as suckers and losers, echoing language he's used before to demean American troops. The reaction in the UK was immediate and furious. Veterans, political leaders, and the public saw this as a betrayal, not just of allies, but of shared sacrifice. And it wasn't lost on anyone that Trump's attacks weren't limited to one country. He was dismissing an entire alliance that bled for the United States when it mattered most. Across Europe, the message was received loud and clear. If leaders don't stand up to Trump now, they will pay for it politically. We're already seeing that play out. In Denmark, right-wing parties that were initially more sympathetic to Trump are losing ground as voters recoil from his threats and insults. The political calculus is shifting. Standing with Trump is becoming a liability, not an asset. At the same time, Trump's alignment with authoritarian figures is becoming more explicit. His so-called Board of Peace isn't a coalition of democracies. It's a gathering of strongmen and autocrats. No NATO members, no democratic allies, just figures like Vladimir Putin and other leaders who crush dissent, rig elections, and rule through fear. That alone tells you everything about what Trump means by peace. Behind the scenes, figures like Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner have been engaging with Russian leadership, openly courting Putin as Trump talks about unfreezing Russian assets that were frozen in response to the invasion of Ukraine. The message Putin is sending is barely subtle. Unfreeze the money, legitimize my power, and I'll reward you. Trump, in turn, calls it diplomacy and brags about what a great trip Davos was. But even Trump's claims about progress are unraveling. He's boasting about a supposed framework deal with NATO and Denmark over Greenland, but Greenland's own leadership has flatly denied that anything like that exists. The premier of Greenland has said plainly that Trump is making it up. There is no deal, no framework, no agreement, just bluster. And yet Trump keeps repeating the lie, insisting something monumental has been achieved while reality says otherwise. This pattern is familiar. It's the same behavior he displayed after the 2020 election: fabricate success, deny facts, and double down when confronted with the truth. That brings us back to Trump's obsession with relitigating the 2020 election. Even now, he's reposting fringe conspiracy accounts and claiming there were hundreds of thousands of vote switches in Pennsylvania. These claims were litigated, debunked, and thrown out of court years ago. Many of the lawyers who pushed them lost their licenses. Courts at every level rejected them. But Trump cannot let it go. And the contrast with other democracies is glaring. In Brazil, former President Jair Bolsonaro was prosecuted and sentenced to decades in prison for attempting an insurrection and undermining democracy. In the United States, Trump was handed sweeping immunity by a Supreme Court that many Americans increasingly see as disconnected from public accountability. That disparity is feeding a growing sense that the system itself is broken and rigged in favor of the powerful. That sense of injustice is not abstract. It's deeply personal for communities being targeted right now. The Trump administration's immigration tactics have crossed a moral line for many Americans, and nothing illustrates that more clearly than the case of 5-year-old Liam Canejo Ramos. Federal agents kidnapped Liam and used him as bait to lure out his father. Both were then sent to detention facilities in El Paso, Texas. When asked about it at a press conference, Trump's border officials didn't express remorse. They smiled. They claimed Liam was doing great and said it doesn't get any better than ICE custody. That alone horrified people watching. Then came the attempt to shift blame. DHS officials claimed the child was abandoned by his father, arguing that the father, running from armed agents, somehow justified the kidnapping of a 5-year-old. They even bragged about taking the child to McDonald's, as if fast food somehow erases the trauma of being ripped from your family and placed in a detention system where dozens of people have died in the past year alone. When reporters pressed for basic facts, did the father have a criminal record? What crimes were committed? What was the legal status of the child? The officials admitted they didn't know. They had no answers, just cruelty, excuses, and propaganda. This is the backdrop against which J.D. Vance mocked protesters in Minnesota, calling them sex offender, criminal aliens, and domestic terrorists, simply for standing in sub-zero temperatures to oppose ICE raids. That kind of language is straight out of the authoritarian playbook. Dehumanize dissenters, criminalize protest, label opposition as enemies of the state, but the response from the people on the ground tells a very different story. When asked why they were out protesting in minus 20-degree weather, one protester said simply, "We're stronger than them. Stronger because they're together. Stronger because they refuse to be divided. Stronger because they love their neighbors and their communities." That's the part Trump and his allies don't seem to understand. Fear can control people for a while, but solidarity can outlast it. And what's happening right now, from Minnesota to New York, from the streets to the workplace, is a signal that something fundamental is shifting. And this is where everything starts to come together, because what we're seeing right now isn't a collection of random events. It's a pattern. It's the collision of authoritarian behavior at the top with a growing refusal from ordinary people to accept it as normal. Donald Trump isn't just lashing out because people are protesting. He's lashing out because those protests are exposing the limits of his power. A general strike, real labor action, sustained resistance in freezing temperatures, those are things authoritarian leaders fear more than bad headlines. You can ignore criticism. You can spin scandals. You can bully politicians. But when workers stop working and communities stop cooperating, the illusion of control starts to crack. That's why Trump's rhetoric has become so unhinged. Everyone who opposes him is suddenly an insurrectionist. Protesters are criminal aliens. Nurses demanding fair pay are somehow part of a shadowy conspiracy. Climate scientists are enemies of the state. This isn't policy language, it's dehumanization. And history tells us exactly where that kind of language leads if it goes unchecked. The cruelty on display from Trump's immigration apparatus is not accidental. It's the point. The kidnapping of a 5-year-old child and the casual way officials joked about it at a press conference wasn't a mistake or bad messaging. It was a signal, a warning, a message meant to instill fear. When officials say a child is doing great in detention, when they blame a parent for running from armed agents, when they admit they don't even know whether a crime was committed, they're telling the public that humanity no longer factors into decision-making. That's why people are calling these tactics fascistic. Not as a slogan, but as a description. Collective punishment, family separation, propaganda, dehumanization, the use of state force to terrorize communities. These are not normal tools of democratic governance, and while this is happening at home, Trump is aligning himself ever more openly with foreign authoritarians, praising Vladimir Putin, courting autocrats, mocking democratic allies, insulting soldiers who died fighting alongside Americans, rewriting history to serve his ego. This isn't America first. It's isolation, corruption, and submission to strongmen who see democracy as a weakness. What Trump and his inner circle seem incapable of grasping is that this kind of behavior doesn't just radicalize opposition, it unifies it. When nurses in New York see immigrant families terrorized in Minnesota, they recognize the same system exploiting them both. When workers see billions spent on vanity projects while their health care is stripped away, they connect the dots. When protesters are labeled criminals for standing in the cold, they understand that silence won't protect them either. That's why the general strike matters so much. It's not just about one state or one issue. It's about reclaiming power from a regime that only understands force and obedience. It's about reminding those in charge that nothing functions without the consent and participation of the people they govern. J.D. Vance mocking protesters for standing outside in sub-zero temperatures might play well in a right-wing echo chamber, but to everyone else it revealed something else entirely. Fear. Fear of commitment, fear of solidarity, fear of people who are willing to endure discomfort because they believe something is wrong and worth resisting. The protester who said, "We're stronger than them," wasn't speaking metaphorically. Strength isn't just numbers, it's endurance, it's community, it's refusing to be isolated or turned against one another. It's showing up again and again, even when it's hard, even when it's cold, even when those in power try to humiliate and intimidate you. This is the moment Trump keeps trying to distract from with golden arches, conspiracy theories, and recycled election lies. Because if the focus stays on collective action, on strikes, on solidarity, on resistance, the spell breaks. People stop asking what Trump wants and start asking what they deserve. And what they're demanding isn't radical. It's dignity, safety, fair pay, health care, freedom from fear, a government that doesn't kidnap children, mock the dead, or side with dictators, a democracy that actually defends itself when it's under attack. Whether this general strike grows or not, whether it becomes historic or simply foundational, One thing is already clear. The old playbook isn't working anymore. Fear isn't enough. Lies aren't enough. And brute force only accelerates the backlash. Trump may be ranting, his officials may be sneering, his allies may be mocking protesters in the cold, but out there in Minneapolis and St. Paul, in New York, and beyond, people are standing together and saying no. And once that happens at scale, once people realize they are not alone, authoritarianism starts to lose its grip. That's what this moment is really about. Not just resistance, but recognition. The recognition that power ultimately comes from the people, and that they are finally beginning to act like it. And that's the part Trump and his allies can't spin away, mock into submission, or arrest out of existence. Once people recognize their collective power, once they stop waiting for permission from broken institutions, the entire balance shifts. That's what scares authoritarian movements the most. Not criticism, not satire, not even elections on their own. What terrifies them is solidarity that turns into action. You can see it in how frantic the messaging has become. Everything is suddenly an emergency. Everyone is suddenly an enemy. Protesters are criminals, workers are saboteurs, immigrants are threats, journalists are liars, scientists are extremists. This is what regimes do when they feel control slipping. They narrow the circle of who counts as real citizens and try to intimidate everyone else into silence. But silence isn't happening. People are showing up anyway, in brutal cold, after long shifts, with real risks to their jobs and their safety. Nurses walking picket lines, workers refusing business as usual, communities protecting one another, parents, students, elders, immigrants, citizens, undocumented people, all realizing that the same machinery grinding one group down today will come for another tomorrow. That's why the general strike matters even beyond its immediate impact. It changes the psychology. It reminds people they are not isolated, not powerless, not crazy for seeing what's happening. And once that mental shift happens, fear loses its effectiveness. You can threaten people who feel alone. You can't easily threaten people who feel united. Trump's fixation on golden monuments, fabricated victories, and endless grievances is a distraction from that reality. It's an attempt to project dominance at the exact moment his authority is being questioned from the ground up. While he posts images of imaginary triumphs, real people are building real resistance in real time. And history is very clear on this point. Authoritarian systems don't collapse because leaders suddenly grow a conscience. They collapse when ordinary people withdraw their consent, when they stop cooperating, when they stop believing the lies, when they decide that dignity is worth more than obedience. What's happening right now may be messy, it may be uneven, it may face setbacks, but it is not nothing. It is the early stage of people reclaiming agency in a system that has treated them as expendable for far too long. So whether this moment becomes the largest general strike in U.S. history or simply the spark that leads to something even bigger, it already represents a line being drawn, a refusal to normalize cruelty, a refusal to accept corruption as inevitable, a refusal to let fear be the organizing principle of public life. Trump can rant, his officials can sneer, his allies can mock people freezing in the streets, but they can't unsee what's happening now. And neither can the people who have decided they're done being passive spectators to their own erosion. This is what the beginning of real resistance looks like. Not polished, not perfect, but alive, determined, and growing.